and I'll share my screen. How's that sound? And let me just move things around, because one of the things when I'm sharing my screen is that I can't see certain things. Excellent. Okay, welcome everybody to this webinar around leading and assessing STEM. David has pretty much introduced me relatively well. It was only 5 years at RMIT though, David, but I have worked at Monash University and have spent some time overseas as well. So for those of you who don't know me, my background actually is as a scientist and an engineer. I have degrees in both, and my PhD is in mechanical engineering. And as I say to schools and teachers that I work with, worse than all that is I taught aerospace engineering at RMIT for 5 years. So I literally taught rocket science. But it was at university and teaching aerospace engineering that I started to get really interested in the whole educational curriculum development and pedagogy, because the students coming through into aerospace engineering needed to get ATAR scores of 90 and above generally to be able to get into the course. Yet I saw that in a lot of ways they weren't critical thinkers, they weren't collaborators, problem solvers, all of those sort of 21st century skills that we talk about. So that began my whole journey into education, curriculum development, pedagogy, and the world has turned a full circle back into STEM learning. So, here I am 13 years into beginning my consultancy, where I'm now working a lot with schools around developing authentic STEM learning. One of the things about what we're going to be talking about, and you can see there's the intentions of today. Is if you've ever worked with me, you know that I like to have a lot of inquiries as part of the webinars. Today's webinar is actually quite an action-packed one. It's probably jammed quite a bit into this one, so it might go over the hour if you want to stick around. I'm unsure about that, but you never know when you start something how long it'll take. But this is really a shortened exploration today of several decades worth of work and thinking. And in fact, a number of the materials that you'll see me talking about and presenting today have been developed as part of a STEM book that I'm writing for Hawker Brownlow. And its focus is primary school, but the thinking and the materials I'm developing is equally applicable to secondary schools, because I notice we have a mixture there of both primary and secondary schools who are here today. So we'll be discussing your, perceptions and challenges, and there'll be an opportunity for you to jump on the chat box in a moment and talk about those. And then I'm going to look into two elements. One is where teachers need to develop themselves to lead STEM learning. And a lot of this information has not only come from my work and my experience in schools, but during the last lockdown, the first lockdown here in Victoria, I interviewed a number of teachers, STEM teachers from around Australia, to get their perspective. And these six areas that I'm going to talk about came from there. And then I'm going to talk about assessment. And as you'll discover, assessment is a little bit of a holy grail quest. So let's get straight into it without too much talking. Here's an opportunity for you to jump on the chat box and start expressing yourselves. And the two questions I'm asking you is, what do you feel is important to measure when you're assessing STEM learning? And then secondly, what have been the challenges that you've experienced in leading STEM learning? So what's important to measure, and what are your challenges at the moment? Let's get you to jump on the chat box and start talking about that. some great sharing there, from things from, your 4 Cs, your collaboration, your critical thinking, your problem solving, the design process there, dealing with some of the challenges have been around people being hooked by the acronym of STEM and not realizing it's really about the thinking frameworks, and it's quite universal. Yep. The pedagogy of it all, unwillingness to invest the time. So I'm thinking cycle there again. Time for integration. Yep, those assumptions around STEM that it's only about coding or technology. Fostering students' confidence in thinking outside the square and critical thinking is a challenge, yep. Measuring and assessing skills is a challenge, absolutely. What else? What do you feel is important? And what has been your experience in terms of the challenges? I'm not sure if someone's just taken over my screen. Is Amanda? STEM is not just 3D printing. Put emphasis in the process rather than the product. Absolutely there, Rachel. Teacher assumptions about student knowledge. Consistent understanding. No investment in developing a STEM culture. Well, keep answering those questions as I move forward and I get into them. But feel free at any time to jump in the chat box and ask questions, or keep your thinking out loud, or put your thinking out loud there. So today I'm going to talk about, as I said right at the start, 2 aspects of growing the capacity of developing STEM learning in your schools. And the first one I'm going to talk about is the 6 areas that teachers really need to develop their capacity around STEM learning. And then secondly, we'll look at the students as STEM learners and sort of the assessment of them. And in fact, one of the things that I'll really highlight is how assessment is actually intrinsic and completely part of STEM learning, simply because it's all part of the design process. So let me begin with the teacher aspect, right? And there's this nice little diagram which reflects the stages of effectiveness that teachers go through when they're beginning to learn something new. Now, for many teachers, you're not trained in the thinking, mindset, and practicalities of STEM, of design thinking, of the whole nature of leading these sort of transdisciplinary subjects. And often the first step, you go through a number of different stages of effectiveness. And often the first step really is you're not aware that you don't know what you don't know, right? So there's that unconscious incompetence or unconscious unskilled aspect is where many teachers begin when they're beginning this whole process. Now, by the way, I'm sharing this because you might find yourself in one of these places, but also you might be able to look at across the teachers that you're talking to and find themselves, and you can say, oh, I see that they're in that sort of place, right? So as a teacher becomes aware of where they're unskilled, they then move into that conscious incompetence or conscious unskilled. So you're aware that you don't know what you don't know. And it's in this phase that a lot of the learning occurs. And in fact, a lot of effort is in this place because it's all about practicing and developing the skill. And over time, you get to the level of conscious competence or conscious skilled. You still have to think about what you're doing consciously, but you have a lot more skill about it. Eventually, where you want to reach is a level of unconscious competence or unconscious skilled. And that's a really quite high level because what it requires is that the habits and practices of STEM learning, the thinking, the mindset, and the practicalities is just automatic for you. And that will take many years. I promise you, it will take many years. And if that takes you as an individual many years, you can imagine what it takes for a school to develop the systems and the structures and the processes for that. So I want to talk about 6 particular broad areas to develop yourself in. The first area is around a mindset. One of the key things that I found in myself and in anyone that is at least at the level of conscious competence is that teachers have developed the capacity to not be stopped by challenges and obstacles. Well, some of the ways that this is described by STEM teachers is, that I've interviewed is it could be considered like a have a go mindset or a beginner's mindset or a risk-taking mindset or I can figure it out mindset and so on, right? There's different ways of describing it. But the big barrier that a lot of teachers face is their perception that they need to know and understand how to use the technology or the curriculum completely to be able to teach it well and use it well, right? And in fact, it's that perception that stymies the learning, the creativity, and innovative problem solving. And it's actually opposite to what's needed to create effective STEM learning. So one of the major shifts that teachers experience in their journey to leading effective STEM is the shift in that mindset from sage on the stage to one of being an activator of students and seeing failures and mistakes as learning experiences for everyone. Teachers can learn alongside their students. In fact, some of the best experiences that some of the teachers that I interviewed told me about was that moment when they just sat down with their students, trusted themselves to work with the students and said, let's figure it out together. Now, it can sound risky, but this really is the best approach, right? It's this mindset and approach that allows teachers to authentically model the appropriate problem-solving process and thinking. And in fact, what it does is it encourages the students to drive their own learning. And in fact, rather than you necessarily focusing on, I need to cover this curriculum, I need to do this X, Y, and Z, it actually has you focus on what you're really good at, which is learning. Now, of course, it does help teachers and it adds an extra depth to know how the technology works or being highly trained in your science or mathematics or whatever area. However, what matters more really is instilling that love of learning, being curious and figuring things out as a community. So that's one of the first areas that teachers need to develop their capacity in. Second area, which a number of you sort of pointed to, is that developing your capacity to influence and engage others. So the ability to communicate clearly and convincing others is extraordinarily valuable as part of this whole process of leading effective STEM learning. It's a skill of entrepreneurs. It's a skill of passionate people who are standing for something beyond the everyday. So there's 2 elements of it. One is really effective STEM teachers engage and convince students who don't believe that they can actually can. So one of the big barriers is the unexamined beliefs and perceptions that students have about themselves as learners. Great STEM teachers engage the students in the possibility that they are more capable and extraordinary than they think they are. They interact with parents and share with them about the ground that their kids have been taking. They also interact with other teachers and share about the anecdotal stories of when the kids have done things great. They share about the failures and how they overcame them. They're really individuals who realize that one of their missions as a STEM teacher is to be sharing what's possible, right? They share progress, that the students are making with school leaders. And this is actually a critical importance when you're talking about shifting a culture within a school, because that sharing starts to engage other teachers in what is possible from STEM learning, but it also starts to shift the perception about who the students are and what's possible for the students as part of that. Effective STEM teachers develop the ability to make cases for action and tell engaging short stories that influence the head, heart, and the hands of the listeners. Now, why is this storytelling, influencing, and communication aspect so important? Hattie really summed it up in his part of his analysis around effect sizes. Beliefs have enormous impact. The effect size for feedback, which leads to around 8 months of progress, is 0.73. So you can see these elements where teachers shared belief about the difference that their work will make to students, finding student expectations and beliefs about themselves, teacher beliefs and conceptions about a student beliefs about teachers. All of these beliefs can either support or profoundly limit what's possible in learning. So developing your capacity to communicate, to engage, and to challenge those perspectives and beliefs is an extraordinarily powerful element of developing excellent STEM learning. Area 3, and this perhaps takes the most time, and this is around planning. So one of the biggest challenges I've found in working with schools for the past 13 years is that many teachers look at the curriculum content knowledge that needs to be addressed, and then they sequence learning to ensure that the curriculum content knowledge is covered. My analogy for this is that this approach is like building a house piece by piece without having a clear vision and goal of what the house should look and feel like. It's a bit odd that you do it that way. Now, STEM learning is really based upon the habit of planning backwards, with the learning, the knowledge, skills, thinking, and even mindset in mind. Having a backward planning approach is actually core to developing STEM learning. You cannot get away with forward planning in STEM learning. It frees teachers up from, following the curriculum as a checklist, and it actually allows for that creativity that you really are wanting to have in the creation of the learning. And what I mean by that, and this is one of the core elements of the book that I'm writing, is that actually where you begin, and you can see here in stage 1, is it's not that you ignore the curriculum. The first step is deconstructing the curriculum into learning intentions, success criteria, and then having a logical sequence of key understandings. What happens when you do that is not only do you get a deep understanding of what the curriculum is asking, but it actually allows you to see what you want the students to know and be able to do. And then you design your assessment tasks and how you will assess them. And then you create what I call a checklist of steps. You plan those learning experiences and introduction. It takes a significant amount of upfront time to do this. But the more that you do it, the quicker it becomes. And in fact, the freer you are in your classrooms when you get to them. That's one of the things I find really makes a difference. And by the way, this sort of thinking of a backward planning approach, is also important to do across a year. So, when you're beginning the year with a group of students, really you are laying those sort of routines, rules, rights, responsibility, that base of knowledge and skill. But then as you go through the year, the learning you should be developing should be opening up from just knowing into practicing the skills, into then applying the skills by the time they get to term 3, term 4. Now, this is just sort of a general flow, but you could start to think and plan your learning across the year in that sort of structure, in that sort of format. Area 4, developing the appropriate formative assessment approaches, right? Now, as someone pointed out, one of the biggest challenges that they found, or a challenge that they found, is teachers only assessing the end product or the result. That fixation often leads teachers and students to losing sight of the learning journey. In fact, some of the most important outcomes of STEM learning occurs in the formative aspects of it all, right? I'm not, by the way, saying you don't do summative assessment. It's an important part, but it's only a small part of the learning growth that students will be doing. So you need to develop your capacity to create formative assessment structures and approaches that is not contingent on you. In fact, what I'll be talking about a little bit later on is that you can develop structures that allows students to self and peer assess and is core to the process of STEM learning that doesn't require you to do all of that assessment. And in fact, in you training them to be assessment capable, visible learners enables them to become self-regulated learners. So, you know, we want to get into that habit of training kids in that systemic drafting, reflection, evaluation, refinement approach, which is core to the design process. And if you haven't realised it yet, formative classroom assessment really develops students in their self-efficacy, their self-regulation, their ability to observe, analyse and judge their own performance, and self-attribution as well, their perceptions about themselves as success, successful or failure. A lot of that stems from your pedagogical practice of formative assessment. And in fact, really, if you've worked with students from foundation all the way through to year 10, these skills will supercharge the ability of these students to perform at year 11 and year 12, for those of you who are secondary school teachers, right? This is the whole intent, is that obviously when we got a really heavy curriculum load at year 11 and year 12, having the ability to self-regulate oneself as a student, it will make a profound difference. In fact, what you'll find is that your highest performing, academic performing students at year 11 and year 12 actually have a reasonable amount of skill in these sort of areas. Number 5, building on that formative assessment practices, those pedagogical practices, right? And really what I found is the barrier is the preconceived notions that teachers have about their role as teachers, the students' roles as learners, and what learning should look like. Teachers who are skilled STEM practitioners really relate to the students as co-learners, co-teachers and co-designers of the learning, right? Over time, while the teachers may develop the templates and the graphical organisers, they're also working in conjunction with the students to nurture the growth of a culture and an environment of co-learning. They deliberately train their students in the skills of being self-regulated through individual and group conferencing, goal setting, using portfolios, whether they're paper portfolios, whether they're digital portfolios, going through the drafting process and the critique groups, thinking routines and so on, right? They use the language underlying the thinking frameworks, such as the computational thinking of decomposing or deconstructing algorithms, empathizing, ideate, interconnected hypothesis, evidence, evaluate, strategy, and so on. And so the teachers really take themselves on and grow their own capacity to be activators of students and adjust their pedagogical practices. And really, we need to be looking at how are we designing our learning from that sort of teacher-directed, teacher-controlled pedagogy through to the learner-centered and then eventually learner-driven, which means we can't be doing the same thing in our practices with students at the start of the year as we do at the end of the year, or we do in year 2 compared to year 6. You need to really have thought out that progressive scope and sequence, one could say, of pedagogy and the design of assessments and tasks as part of that. Because ultimately, really what we are all here as educators is to develop students to be highly capable learners. And in fact, that's actually what the Australian curriculum is asking. Last area to link for this is, if you get everything that I said, then number 6 is about developing ourselves to be bringing rigor to our own learning. And in my experience, in a lot of ways that teachers have been developing learning, is that it's a very bit airy-fairy unless you are doing a master's or unless you're in a university course, right? If you really want to develop and take yourself on, then you need to start bringing a bit more rigor to your process. And it could be as simply as using a template like this one, a 4-in-1 questions, that every time you're trying something, you are in your classrooms, you capture what you tried, what you learned, what you're pleased about, what you're concerned about, rather than at the end of the unit going, oh, that went well. And then next year when you come to the same unit, you've forgotten what you've learned. Capturing these sort of things. Now, I do know many of you are now getting into data-informed inquiry cycles and reflection as part of your individualized professional growth plans. But doing this sort of work and developing your capacity yourself to review, reflect, and refine not only trains you in the design process, but it also allows you to capture evidence of growth and learning as part of that. So what you need to do is do this sort of work where you reflect, plan, act, observe, reflect, plan, act, observe, and so on like that. You'll gather that evidence. You'll get clear about what works and what doesn't for each and every student. It'll give you evidence to convince others and then therefore communicate to others. And it'll make the difference that many of you do, while you're STEM teachers, is you want to make to the school. So opportunity for you to do a bit of chatting is, where do you see you need to develop your capacity in? Now, I know there's 6 and you might say all 6, but what's the main ones that you see you want to develop your capacity in? I'll give you a few minutes to type that into the box. What's your main area? For those of you, I see a number of you are saying number 6. You really need to develop as an action research project. That's the only way you're going to lead change. And, even if you do a really simplified action research project, I've got templates for that. But these sort of structures is something that you need to be working on over a period of a long period of time. So action research projects with those 4-in-1 questions. I'll send you the template, by the way, as a post-session materials of the 4-in-1 questions. Great. Anybody else wants to jump in and where you see you need to develop your capacity? Thanks, Shane. The other thing you may want to look at, by the way, as you're thinking about where you want to develop yourself in, is you could actually assess yourself in those. You can see the little steps there from unconscious incompetence to conscious incompetence and so on for each of the 6 areas. won't ask you to necessarily do that in the chat box, but that could be something that's quite useful for you to reflect upon. As the areas, it's like, oh, I didn't even know about that, which is unconscious, unskilled, all the way through to, oh yeah, I just, unconsciously behave like that. That's really great. Okay, let me keep going. So let's talk about developing student capacity, and I'll link it all to assessment, right? So first question the teachers, when I ask teachers, what are you assessing? More often than not, what teachers tend to assess or what schools require to assess is driven by the structure of your reports. Now, let's go back to what the Australian curriculum says is important, and I'll talk about the breadth of it, right? And then I'll talk about the how. So we'll look at the what, and then we'll look at the how. So primarily, the technologies curriculum, which I'll use as a sort of foundational curriculum to think about, is about developing student ability to create a solution. Okay, solution-oriented learners, right? Whether it's a digital solution or a design solution, creating solutions is the core of the technologies curriculum. Now, what that requires is that students acquire the knowledge inherent in the curriculum, the digital and design knowledge. They need to be thinking from and operating from the thinking frameworks, your computational thinking, design thinking, systems thinking, and those sort of processes that are involved in that. And they need to learn the ability to project manage and those production skills as part of it. So many of you did speak of those sort of skills as important within the developing STEM learning and the areas that you might feel a bit challenged by or what you think is important to measure. But given that we're talking about STEM, you can also look at any of the curriculum areas, those discipline curriculum areas, and you'll see, hey, there is certain discipline-specific knowledge, there's certain discipline-specific skills. So in mathematics, reasoning is one of those important areas, as is problem solving. And there are certain ways of thinking as part of that. So you could look at those sort of relationship diagrams which show the key ideas and show the strands, and the Australian curriculum tells you these are the things that we should be assessing. Similarly, if our goal is to fundamentally develop highly capable learners who drive the learning themselves, then it's actually critical that one of the elements that we assess is the general capabilities. And I do know that a lot of schools are still grappling with that, right? How do we plan for, teach, and assess the general capabilities? So in essence, really what I'm saying is that there are three aspects that we need to be assessing for STEM. If you're going to fulfill on the purpose of STEM, and the purpose of STEM fundamentally is to develop highly capable learners who can create solutions and do the process to achieve those solutions, then we need to be able to assess the knowledge, skill, and thinking specific to the curriculum areas that are being covered. We need to develop and assess their capacity in the underlying thinking frameworks. And we need to assess learning progression in the general capabilities. Now, when I say this to teachers, more often than not, it's like, oh my God, how are we going to do all of that? Right? It seems like a lot. And a lot of that sort of thinking comes from that you think you have to do it all yourself. One of the big shifts really is that you have to start looking at how can we use this as a design challenge and figure out how to do it in a way that the students do it rather than the teachers, because essentially teachers are the bottleneck. So when you look at the approaches, really the discipline specific is you can measure formatively as well as summatively. Thinking frameworks, mostly formatively, but some summatively. And the general capabilities will be mostly formative. So just a little bit of feedback from people. When I say those three areas, the discipline, the thinking frameworks, and general capabilities, why do you think all those three are important? Problem-based learning will definitely be part of it, Shane. That's just an example of how one would go about it. It's just one of those sort of, it's what I termed earlier as either bounded or open-ended sort of problem. That's certainly a pedagogy and approach that one would use. Why would these three areas be important? Just want to sort of check in your thinking. It looks at the whole child, Julie, great. It definitely matters to the employers. They'll need those skills in their careers, yep. It creates those active 21st century citizens. It's transferable, yep. Christine agrees with you, Michelle. Adrian, it's even more than see, and it's great that many of you saying, and I imagine you might be secondary school teachers talking about wide areas of employment. It's actually life skills. See, I'd assert that many of you, when you do design your assessment, many of you just focus on the discipline-specific elements. Really, a whole new world opens up when you start to have structures and processes in place to develop the students in the thinking frameworks and general capabilities. A whole heap of things will open up and it'll be beneficial both to the students, but also to the way that your classrooms look. And in fact, as Cheryl has pointed out, while you may know the knowledge, it's in the application that actually makes the biggest difference. Now, one of my experiences last year, I went in and the Catholic Education Melbourne had a STEM MAD conference where they had, students from, I think, primary and secondary students from about 60 odd schools presenting their STEM projects. The most fascinating thing for me was a lot of those kids essentially were showing off. They got into the prototype phase with what they produced. For the 2 or 3 schools or projects that the kids went to actually building the model and building something in reality, there was an enormous growth in their understanding of the thinking frameworks and of the general capabilities and how they saw themselves, because they really had to problem solve in real life to build a working model. And that's what I'm really talking about, is embedding the structures and the way one goes about it, example, problem-solving learning, to achieve those sort of outcomes. The greatest growth occurs when we're assessing all of these 3 elements. So let's talk about how we would start going about doing it. Right. So I'm going to show you some of the work that's captured in the book that I'm writing. Now, again, as I show you this stuff, and by the way, this is in the handouts. These materials are in the handout that you got sent when you registered, which is the Leading and Assessing STEM Learning handout. So you'll see some of the examples there. My book obviously goes into a lot more detail about these and its primary focus, but equally, it could be used in secondary schools as well, right? So as part of the process of backward planning, the process of backward planning has you deconstruct the curriculum to get a deeper understanding of what it's asking. In essence, as you can see in this, what's in the handouts and also in the figure that I'm showing on the screen at the moment, is that you can deconstruct it into learning intentions. We are learning to investigate scientifically and make predictions so we can explain why Earth has regular changes such as day and night. That's your learning intention. Into directly observable, concrete success criteria. Right? Identify questions that I wonder, write a list of questions, select questions, make predictions. Right? These, when you do this work, not only do the teachers become crystal clear, what happens is you've got these measurable success criteria, which you can then put into a document like this. Because authentically, if the kids just ticked off, yes, I've achieved that success criteria, and they only demonstrate once, that is a very shallow level of acquiring knowledge. However, if you go through this sort of gradual release of responsibility template, this sort of structure, you could use this to have the students self-assess and peer assess and gather evidence, right? And it's really applicable to kids at different levels. So, if you use this across a whole unit, there'll be times that you'll be introducing certain elements and then suddenly the kids will have heard of this. But kids who perhaps struggle may only get to, I can do this with help, whereas your upper quartile of kids, your expectation of them would be to have taught this to somebody else and gathering evidence of that. Again, you see that these sort of templates are designed from that design thinking sort of mode. And, when you do this sort of work, you can really build upon it in many different ways and even have the students reflect upon their strategies and so on like that. You can also do these sort of things with the general capability. So one of the things about the general capability documents in the Australian curriculum is that they actually have these statements for levels, which are 2-year cycles effectively. One of the things that I've done with a couple of primary schools is I've deconstructed 4 of the elements of the general capabilities. So your personal and social capability, your critical and creative thinking, your ethical understanding and intercultural understanding. And what we did was that we created them, broke it down into success criteria. Now, one of the great things about doing something like this and using something like this, I can't remember if I got 2 elements there, is that suddenly, for example, you are a grade 3-4 teacher, you can grab the elements of, say, 2, 3, 4, 5 for understand themselves as learners and suddenly put that into a rubric. Or you might pre-assess student levels in your classroom by having them have a go at filling out the key rows that you're focusing on in this upcoming unit, and then choose the statements that you would be most applicable for students to grow. So you could say level 2 is below standard, level 3 is at standard low, level 4 is at standard high, and level 5 is proficient or above standard. You could design structures like that with the general capabilities. Suddenly, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. It's applicable across all the year levels. All teachers can be using it. And that way you get consistency across multiple year levels just through creating documents like this. I can give you access to this sort of stuff so you can see where it comes from as well. The other element, apart from designing these sort of directly observable success criteria, is, and you heard me mention it, in rubrics. Now, the VCAA put out only in the last year or so, or 2 years now, a whole document about developing rubrics. If you haven't seen it, it is a brilliant document. Because the essence of creating rubrics, and in fact, rubrics are one of the best ways, formatively and summatively, to design assessment and formative assessment that students can use, right? What they unpacked is that progression of competency in a skill or a knowledge or in thinking. Because in doing that sort of work, what it does is that not only does it make it distinct for the learners so the students can start to self-assess and peer assess, it also makes it really clear for ourselves. But a lot of, I'm going to be a little bit harsh here. A lot of the rubrics that I see are rubbish. So let me show you some of the work that I've been doing. This is from Malvern Valley Primary School, and this is from a grade 5-6 Natural Disasters Minecraft unit. So you can see a bit of the structure that I worked with Josh Velez at Malvern Valley. Now, I'm not saying this is perfect, by the way, but look at the structure. notice that there's no grading on it. I dislike grading as part of rubrics, simply because what the research shows is as soon as you put a grade on it, that extrinsic motivation is what the kids focus on rather than on developing skill. It actually stunts progression. You can see he's chosen 4 different areas to focus on, and then he's unpacked it from essential, developing, capable, proficient. Now, notice that I don't have a not shown column or not done column. Those are sort of hangovers from the summative world. If you're working on a unit and you have a formative rubric used over the time, there is no not shown or not done. Kids, you need to set a minimum expectation, and that's where the essential level is, right? Kids can look at this, use it the language, student-friendly language at the age appropriate, and work their way across. Okay, so I've created a list of questions that I can use to guide my research. Well, the next step is, and so on. What Josh has done here is that he's highlighted certain words in yellow, and this is what he's going to talk to the students about and scaffold their learning such that they can understand what the rubric is. And then certain evidence that the kids could be gathering as part of that. So this is an example of the sort of rubrics that you can develop. For those of you in secondary schools, I also did some work with St. Bernard's College in Essendon. And what we did was we deconstructed the science inquiry skills for the science team. So I worked with the science team, and you can see I created the success criteria of what questioning, we broke down what questioning, predicting, and what the content descriptors and the elaborations actually spoke about, and then unpacked them into a learning sequence. So if a student who's at year 7 can do everything up to, I can formulate my own aim, question, problem, claim to be investigated scientifically, they are operating at a year 10 level. And that's one of the main challenges that I have with a lot of the rubrics that are developed by schools, is that they're not upwardly or downwardly compatible. Doing this sort of work and designing these sort of rubrics really allows, like the general capabilities progression, for students at any year level, you'll have statements that will capture your lower performers and your higher performers, those kids who are above and below the standard level. And that really makes a difference, because then kids can actually progress. Now, as part of, and for those of you who are involved or coming along to the student agency webinar that I'm running on Monday, I'll get more into that. But one of the key elements is developing students to be self-regulated. Now, the general capabilities do talk about that to a certain extent, but there's some great work that was done out of research that was done out of the University of Melbourne as part of their REAP project, or realising the potential of high-performing students. I can't remember what the actual acronym is, but they actually had some written description progressions in that, which I deconstructed into statements that can actually be used by students to assess. And again, this is something that you can do, and you can see I've actually mapped it to a cyclical model of learning as part of that. They'll be in the materials that I'll send you. But then suddenly, hey, you've got structures that you can embed into your classrooms that allow students to self-assess and peer assess, but also opens up the opportunity for teachers to start discussing self-regulation authentically within the classrooms. Finally, last one. Now, remember one of the areas that I said that you needed to develop the students in and assess is around the thinking frameworks. One of the, how do I say it? The time that I had available during these lockdown period has been quite productive, one could say. And so what I did was I took the production and processes aspects of the design and technologies curriculum and broke it apart. One of my issues with production and processes documents is that they don't really show a progression in depth of skill in design thinking or in processes and so on like that. So what I did was spend about 2 to 3 months deconstructing it and mapping it to the Stanford design model. You empathize, define, ideate, prototype, so on like that, and created this document. So you can see I've broken apart, like empathize is the process of identifying goals and sub-goals of the challenge and task, giving up assumptions, gathering information and data, and putting yourself in the shoes of the user so as to come to a deep understanding of the challenge and who you are designing for. And I've got a little note there that includes the computational thinking skill of decomposition and the investigating element of the design and technologies strand. So, simple document. This can be used no matter what year level you're at. Obviously, if you're working with P to 2, you might simplify this even more and use that sort of, as Shane's pointed out, Dreyfus model of skill acquisition. I've used the solid taxonomy as much as possible in that, but it's the last column which is perhaps the most important. What teachers would do is create an age level appropriate empathize strategy document of the approaches that would be used at that age level. So what would be used at prep to 2s would be different than what is used at 5 to 6s, which is different than what would be used at 9 to 10. And therefore, this document would allow you to, pick and choose elements of it and go, hey, this is how I'm going to develop the students. We're focusing on empathize in this unit. Therefore, these are the skills I need to develop. So there's structures like this that can be used to automatically embed in your learning. So how do you use them? Basically, no matter what the rubric is, talk it over with your students, right? Give them to ask questions, opportunity to ask questions, to clarify, to know what it looks like, right? Have the students use them to self-assess and peer assess. Have them gather evidence of progression. And then lastly, if you notice that your rubric, the students have an irregular pattern of progression, then you might need to revise your rubric as part of it. Don't take this, even the work that I do, as the answer or the right way of doing things. But again, you need to then start embedding certain processes and approaches in your classroom. Like this again is from Steph at Northern Valley. She has a conferencing template that when she runs STEM units, she actually conferences with teams of students. And you can see, that it requires students to identify the design thinking stage they're currently in, and they may go back and forth, because it's not a linear progression. But the kids start to get into that model of thinking and practice of filling this in even before they get to their conference with the teacher. You could have posters, that give students strategies about answering questions. Research organisers designing templates such as this one on the right to develop students to become proficient at research, and therefore whenever they do research, your expectation is they fill in one of these research organisers, because clearly students have that bad habit of cutting and pasting and so on. So let me get out of this. Let me just give you an opportunity. Are there any questions you want to ask of me? If you want to find some of these materials, they're on this our STEM conference website. You can see it there, the STEM learning resources. But if you have any questions, I'll turn this off and chuck it in open up the chat.